guys, it's Alec Torelli, and welcome back to another episode of Ask Alec, where I take your questions on poker and answer them in quick, short videos in 5 minutes or less. So today's question comes from Raul, and he asks 4 or 5 questions, and they're all about bluffing. So the generic question is, how do you decide when to bluff in general? And of course, if I could answer this question in a 5-minute video, then I'd be God. But anyway, the key here to consider are 2 basic points. And they may seem trivial, but I'll go into a little more depth and explain better what I mean. So the 2 key factors to have in your favor when you're debating on whether or not to bluff are, number 1 is, can you represent a strong hand? And number 2, does your opponent likely have a weak hand? And those are really the 2 things that you want to have in your favor. And the stronger, compelling story you can tell about you having a strong hand, and the less probability it is that your opponent has a weak hand, the more likely it is that you can successfully bluff. So, for example, if you're playing a hand and you're on the river and your opponent check calls the flop in the turn, and you know, for some reason, whatever reason, based on your reads, the history you have with this opponent, how he's acting, any myriad of reasons, you know that your opponent would never check call here in this spot on the flop and the turn with a really strong hand. If he had a super strong hand, he would have check raised the flop or check raised the turn or let out on the river. So you know that his range is what we call capped, meaning the best hand he could have is a bluff catcher. It's a mediocre hand. This gives you one of the 2 components that are compelling for a time to bluff. Right? You know that the best hand your opponent could have is not a good one. So you know that he doesn't have a really, really strong hand, and this is a compelling time to bluff. But that's only half the story here. The other half of the story is, can you credibly represent a strong hand at the same time that your opponent doesn't have a strong hand? So if you were to bet the flop, bet the turn, and bet the river while your opponent's check calling you, can you credibly represent a strong hand? Is it likely that you would bet this way with a hand that beats his or the nuts? Or do you have a good hand often enough to be betting here? So when you have both those things in your favor, man, bluff away. It's a good spot. All right, you asked me a few specific questions. I'm going to run through these real quick. I want to keep this video short. Number 1, do you bluff when you're card dead? No, you don't want to be bluffing based on your cards, because you're basically deciding on your bluffing frequency based on sort of the variance involved in the game. In other words, how often you're receiving a good hand or not a good hand should be determining on when you bluff. That's really not what you should be considering. It should actually be the specific situation you're facing and using the 2 pieces of advice I talked about earlier. Can you represent a strong hand, and is it likely your opponent has a weak hand? If you're card dead, sometimes the best strategy is just to be patient and fold until you pick up a hand or you pick up an opportunity to bluff, right? That's the best way to go. So number 2, if you're playing tight in a session, would you use your image to bluff once in a while? So you'll notice that every single sub question you have here goes back to the 2 key points we talked about in the beginning. This influences half of your decision on whether or not you should be bluffing. If you have a really tight image, it gives more credence to the fact that you can credibly represent a strong hand. So if you're going to play off your tight image, that's great. And if make sure your opponents believe you, or that they're aware of the fact that you have a tight image. If you're playing against someone that's just some crazy calling station that doesn't care about your hand at all, don't use your tight image as a justification to bluff, because that would be stupid. He's not paying attention, right? So make sure that this actually has value and that your opponent's aware of this stuff. And then yes, using your tight image could be a good situation. Make sure you don't do it though when your opponent has the nuts, because it doesn't matter if you have a tight image, if he has the best hand. Number 3, how frequently would you use bluffs? That's basically to be a sort of a smart aleck, haha, fun, no pun intended. I would say as frequently as you can get away with it. So, I mean, if your opponents don't know you're bluffing, you could be bluffing all the time, and if they think you just made a huge hand, then that's fine. So you really have to be really player dependent here, and this is where poker is much more of an art than a science. It's that finesse calibration that you're going to just need to work on and see exactly how much you can get away with. And lastly, betting every street or check raising. What's more effective while bluffing? In other words, should I be check raising my bluffs or barreling away and just unloading the gun and betting every single street when I'm bluffing? This comes down to your specific opponent, right? So there's not a specific strategy I can tell you that's always going to be the best. It depends on what your opponent perceives as strength. Some opponents perceive check raise as weakness because they say to themselves, well, when you check raise, you could only have the nuts or nothing, and so therefore your hand range is more weak. I'm going to call him down. I'm not going to fold. Against that player, you shouldn't check raise. But against another player that thinks to himself, wow, when he check raises, he must have a set, it's a great spot to check raise on a bluff. All right, man, I gave you a ton of info here. That's more time than we have for today. I hope you enjoyed this. If you guys have questions you'd like me to answer, shoot them over to me. I'll pick the best ones and answer them right here on Ask Alec. Until next time, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys next week. Cheers.